So Module 7, we're basically going to talk about what are the 4 types of federal assistance instruments identified in 2 CFR 200. So there's different types of federal assistance, and there's one that we particularly use mostly in Federal Highway Administration. Then where are we going to find project agreement provisions? You're going to see now in this module and continuing into Module 8, we're going to bounce around from 2 CFR 200 and our 23 CFR and 23 USC requirements. So we'll be going back and forth. Project agreement provisions. So we have our federal assistance instruments in 2 CFR 200. Project agreement provisions are in 23 CFR. Then we're going to talk about the project life cycle, and we're going to watch one of the Federal Essential videos. We're going to talk about period of performance in a lot more detail. So we'll talk about some of your methods for identifying what that period of performance is. We'll talk about some examples, and they're in the back of your book in the Funds Management Guide, but we'll talk about some examples of things you have to consider when you're creating your period of performance depending on what phase of work you're doing. Then we'll talk about advanced construction. So we've mentioned it a couple times. Do you guys use advanced construction here? Okay. Yeah, most states use it, but there are certain things that you have to keep in mind. Remember, we talked about what commits the federal government to pay. Obligation. So we have to obligate the funds before we're obligated to pay for the expenses, and in advanced construction there's no obligation. So that means there's no commitment from the federal government to pay until you convert it. So we'll talk about what that means. And then we'll talk about project closeout requirements. So 2 CFR 200 identifies these 4 assistance instruments, and the one we use is grant agreement. So if you look over there on the right side of the screen, we have some definitions, and notice there's really not a definition for grant agreement. But if you look at cooperative agreement, the difference between a grant agreement and a cooperative agreement is that substantial involvement. So when we do a grant agreement, and this is really the only place that we actually see grant in 2 CFR 200. That's one of the words. We used to call them grants or sub-grants. Now they're called awards, but they still call the actual agreement itself a grant agreement. So basically the difference between a grant agreement and a cooperative agreement is that substantial involvement. Federal Highway Administration, remember, we are assisting. It's state administered, federally assisted. So we do not have substantial involvement. We're not involved in authorizing things. We let the states do it, and then we provide oversight on that. So there is no substantial involvement, so it does not meet the definition of a cooperative agreement. So we use what's called a grant agreement, which is basically an agreement without substantial involvement from the federal awarding agency. We do use cooperative agreements in our federal lands program, because a lot of times our federal lands offices actually act like a state DOT, where they actually contract with a contractor to build a road or improve a road on, say, national park roads or something like that. So we do have cooperative agreements there, or maybe in your FLAP program, the Federal Lands Access Program, federal lands might administer the project instead of having a state or local government do it. And if that happens, there will be a cooperative agreement. A fixed amount award, we can't use that one because it can't be used in programs that have a required matching requirement. We have that. And then a contract, if you remember back, a contract is procurement of goods and services. So you all use contracts, but that doesn't meet the definition here. This is a federal contract. So we use federal contracts on our federal land side. So if federal lands is doing a road in Yellowstone National Park and they're getting a contractor to do the work, then we're going to have a federal contract, and that's what that's talking about there. So we use grant agreement. So now let's jump out to our 23 USC and 23 CFR requirements. So 2 CFR 200 says we use a grant agreement, and then our 23 USC 106 A2 this time says that there is a requirement that states enter into a formal project agreement with Federal Highway for each federal aid project. That formal agreement is in FEMAS for most of our federal aid program. We don't use FEMAS for federal lands. I don't think we use FEMAS, or maybe we do for build. Do we use FEMAS for build, or is that outside? Does anybody know? I don't think we do, because build program is actually not even part of the FAST Act. It's something that's issued out of the appropriations. So in the appropriations of 2020, that's where the build funding was identified, and then that's allocated out to all of the states based on a competitive process for selecting projects. Same previously it was called Tiger. Now it's called build. Now we do have infra, which actually is a discretionary program that's identified in the FAST Act. But basically we have to have that agreement on each federal aid project, and that's primarily in FEMAS. So 23 CFR 630, subpart A, talks about the project authorizations and agreements. So it says that states must obtain an authorization to proceed from federal highway before beginning any work on a federal aid project. So that means you can't start doing any work, you can't even advertise for construction until we have a signed authorization in FEMAS for that project. Now we have exceptions like ER events and that kind of thing that may allow us to do a verbal authorization or for you to start doing work. But for the most part, this is where it says that you cannot do any work prior to authorization. And if you do, then that's going to be on your own dime. Federal government is not going to participate. The other thing it says is we're only going to provide authorization for the phase of work that's ready to proceed. So if you have a construction project that you know it's going to end in construction, but you're only in design, we're not going to authorize construction because there's a lot of other requirements that have to be followed before we can even move to construction phase. So we're going to authorize design, and then as part of design, when you get into final design, you're going to identify the right-of-way that might need to be acquired. You're going to start doing your environmental work, and we can't authorize construction or right-of-way until NEPA determination is made. So it's very important that we're only authorizing the phase of work that we're currently in, because we're not allowed to authorize construction until NEPA is done. Then 106A2 basically says that we're going to issue an authorization to proceed through or after execution of the formal project agreement with the state, and that's basically referring to FEMAS, that FEMAS project agreement. So a lot of people think FEMAS is just a federal system. The F in FEMAS stands for fiscal. That's all true, but that is our official project authorization. So it's very important. That's what we use in federal highway to identify those start dates, end dates, that you're ready to start working on a project. So FEMAS is our official authorization program. So like I said, and I'm not going to go through all these again, but I said we were going to see this twice. And the first time we saw it was in 2 CFR 200.331 related to subaward agreements. This one is very specific to the federal award, so the agreement between Federal Highway and the state DOT. What we've done is we've incorporated all of these data elements into FEMAS, so there's really nothing that you have to do other than complete the FEMAS agreement. You send it over to the division office, and the division office reviews it, checks all of these data elements, and once we sign off on it, we have a project agreement. The only different criteria up there is number 9, budget approved by the federal awarding agency, and we are, because remember, this is 2 CFR 200, so 2 CFR 200 applies to all federal agencies, not just federal highways, so we have to kind of figure out what does this mean for our program. And so we've identified the budget approved as what we're using for that as the STIP reference. So one of the requirements are we can't advance a project or approve a project unless it's identified in your state transportation improvement program and your TIPs. There are some exceptions. Planning projects don't need to be in there. ER projects don't need to be in there. But every other project should be in the STIP, and if it's not in there, we can't authorize it. So that's what that number 9 is. So 23 CFR 630.108, this says, okay, 2 CFR 200.210 said we need these data elements. Our 23 CFR says, in addition to those, we need to have these other items identified. So location, that's a really big one. When we came up with FEMAS 5, probably 7 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, one of the big updates was the location field. So this would be a linear reference GIS type of a location that identifies where that project's going to happen. And so that's a very specific location item that has to be on all of our projects. It's not required in 2 CFR. This is a requirement of Federal Highway Administration in our CFR, 23 CFR. What work is covered by the agreement? Oftentimes we see non-participating. States might have some work that's very specifically they choose not to participate. It could either be it's because it's unallowable or you just choose to not have those costs participate. So we should be identifying and seeing all of the work that's going to be into the project and what part of that is participating and what part's non-participating. Federal share as either a pro rata or lump sum. I talked about that a little bit earlier. Pro rata, it's always going to stay, let's say you're 80-20 throughout the life of the project, regardless of if costs go up or down. Lump sum, that's the maximum federal dollars that are going to participate on that project. You still have to maintain the 80-20, but maybe you have an overrun, and now your pro rata is going to go down. So you're going to have less federal dollars and more state dollars or local dollars because we're saying you're only going to use $1 million. And a lot of times this might happen on allocated programs where you're awarded, $1 million, and that's all you're going to get. And if your costs overrun or your costs increase, then the state dollars are going to have to pick up the difference, and that's going to make your federal share different. It's going to go from an 80-20 maybe to a 60-40 or something like that, and that's okay. But you have to pick that in the beginning, and whatever you choose, you have to stick with it. So if you pick lump sum and then later down the road you go, oh look, we have an overrun and we want to put some other federal dollars on there, we're going to say no because you picked lump sum in the beginning. If you pick pro rata, then we don't care. If the costs increase, we just adjust and we will kick in our federal share of whatever those cost increases are. We have to have a state signature on the project agreement that basically constitutes agreement to the provisions and certifications set forth in 631.12. So does anybody in here sign for the state DOT on project agreements? The final signature? Sometimes? Okay. Yeah, so if you're signing off on those, you're agreeing to those provisions. That's the big thing I wanted to let everybody know, because some people are like, oh, whoever's signing off on those, that person is basically agreeing to all the provisions for the state DOT. And when you're signing the Rec Trails projects, we're signing on behalf of the State Resource Agency, but they should also know when they're signing the paper document that they're agreeing to these same provisions, that they're going to follow all the same rules. And then once the state signs it, we only require one signature from the state. A lot of states have 1 or 2 signatures, but we are required to at least have 2 signatures on the project agreement. So most of the time in the division it might be the finance person and a program engineer. Or sometimes it could be 3 signatures. I've seen it where it's a specialist does the review, maybe an engineer or program manager does the recommend, and then the financial manager does the final signature. And it's really up to the state and the division to decide how you want to do that, but we do have to have 2 from Federal Highway on those. Okay, so you have 2? Yeah, that's good. Okay, good. Yeah, I'm glad you guys have 2, because some states just do 1, but I think 2 is better because you actually have somebody reviewing what somebody else put into the system, because whoever signs that first line most of the time is also the person who entered it in there. Sometimes it might just be an entry person and then it goes to somebody else to sign, but oftentimes I see where it's whoever's entering it signs that first line, so it's good to have that second check.
If it's a batch, then it's not. If it's a batch,
oh, you guys have some batch?
Then it won't be. But typically, if you're like, oh, can you authorize, I certify? It's normally the person, not 100% of the time, but.
So do you guys do electronic push? Oh, okay, that's even better. Yeah, that's even better because you're entering into your state system and then it just pushes what you entered into your state system into FEMA. So that's way better controls. I've been in some states where they have to enter into their state system and then they have to go and manually enter that stuff into FEMA, and we've seen where there's some differences, and that's not a good thing. Yeah. So I'm glad you guys do the electronic data interface, plus you have 2 signatures. That's good. So the other thing that project agreement must do is it has to document by comment, and we have a remarks field, any kind of unique stuff going on with the project. If it's just a standard 80-20 project and you identify your pro rata in there, that's fine. But let's say you guys use toll credits. You should be documenting that. There's a checkbox for toll credits. There's a soft credit or a soft match field where you put those toll credits. I can tell you right now they're doing a big national review on toll credits. So they're going to start looking at how do you accrue toll credits, how do you reconcile your toll credits, how are you tracking which toll credits are being used on projects to make sure you're not using them twice or duplicating it. So just as an FYI, I see some folks up here going,
We have a monthly report we do. So
that's good.
We do it every month, and then finance has a report, but we both do a report, and then they are the ones that say, okay, it's good.
Yeah, that's good.
So we have something in place, so we're ready.
All right, I'm glad. Because it sounds like you guys are pretty good, because I've seen some places that don't really track it very well, or it's very difficult for them to track and reconcile.
And it's in our system too, where we have it in the phone, so we can.
Oh, so you can track it out? Okay, that's good. So if you're doing unique stuff like toll credits or bridge credits or tapered match, you use tapered match here? Probably not if you have toll credits. But some states, you know, like when I was in Wyoming, they were a cash-strapped state. They could barely, you know, they barely had enough state dollars to meet the match. And, you know, and they did have sliding scale, so their match was 90.49. And so they had to only come up with 9.51 in state funds, but they struggled a lot of times. And so, you know, they did use tapered match sometimes on their local projects. And what tapered match does is it allows you to get either all of your federal funds up front in the beginning or all of it at the end, or tapered throughout the life of the project. As long as at the end it's the actual 80-20, we could do some payments at 100% and some payments at 50-50, as long as in the end it equals 80-20. And that's called tapered match, but you have to document that. You have to certify that you meet certain criteria in order to do that. So it's probably good you guys don't have to worry about that, because it is kind of a pain. Donations, that's a big thing. If you have like right-of-way donations, you need to make sure you can account for that, because maybe the state has some right-of-way that you want to donate to a project, and you can use some of that towards your, say, your state match. So if you're going to do that, you should document it that way. And then it sounds like you guys are getting some other types of funding, some other innovative types of funding, so you want to document that kind of stuff too if you're doing TIFIA or bonding or things like that. So then, 630-106. So this was 108, preparation of an agreement. 106 is authorization to proceed. So it kind of goes hand in hand with the agreement, because the agreement is our authorization to proceed for the most part. So basically this is saying that you must get approval or authorization to proceed from Federal Highway before beginning any work. That includes advertising. So you can't advertise for construction without having approval or an authorization first. The state has to submit their project agreement via FEMAS, and what we're going to do in the division is we're going to do some basic checks. We're going to say, hey, is that project in the STIP? We're going to verify the funding, because remember we talked about eligibility. So we do eligibility in the very beginning when we authorize, so we'll say, hey, they're using NHPP funds on this. Is it on an NHS route? So that'll just be a basic check. If it's not on an NHS route, we're going to kick it back and say, sorry, those funds are not eligible off the NHS. So we'll do those basic checks. We're going to double check the rate, the lump sum or pro rata, and we're going to make sure that you guys did the math correctly, because unfortunately FEMAS doesn't have a calculated field, so we have to do that manually, which is a pain. But our divisions have to do that. And I've asked that question many times to our headquarters, and the reason why is because there are so many different, I mean, we don't have a standard 80-20, everybody's at 80-20, then it would be easy. I mean, Wyoming is at 90.49, you guys are at 80-20. Nevada's at 95, so, you know, and there's certain costs that could be participating and certain costs that aren't. So it's a big, I guess, issue for them to do all that background coding for it to be an actual calculated field. But we have to do that manually, division. And then we're going to check those other requirements. If you're moving to construction, hey, do you have right-of-way cleared? Do you have your NEPA document? We're going to check that stuff. Now, Federal Highway signs a project agreement. We have to have at least 2 signatures in the division, like we said. So now, before I get into that, we're going to watch a video. And these are pretty good videos. So this one's called A Process from Cradle to Grave. Yeah, there we go.
You wouldn't think of starting out on a trip without knowing where you were going. The same is true for local public agencies as they consider a project of any scope. Think of a transportation project being developed under the Federal Aid Highway Program as an extended road trip with a series of required waypoints. It's a good idea to have a map that shows where you're going and how to get there. This presentation will provide you a sound understanding of the phases or building blocks and the major approval milestones. America has the best transportation system in the world where safety is the top priority. The Federal Highway Administration values the public trust of delivering quality projects and protecting the civil rights of everyone who is affected. Understanding this program and how projects are advanced will help to preserve this trust and continued confidence. Projects that use Federal Aid Highway Program funds typically follow a series of 6 fundamental phases of development. Each phase embodies the building blocks leading to successful project delivery for your local public agency. The first phase is planning. Your transportation needs and ideas are conceptualized during the planning phase. Next, building upon the decisions initiated in planning, the project moves forward through the 5 remaining phases of development, from environmental studies, design, right-of-way, construction, and ending at maintenance and operation. As the project progresses through each of the 6 phases, your local public agency also must take into account 3 major approval milestones: environmental document approval, plans, specifications, and estimates, and closing the project. Obtaining approval at each of the milestones advances the project. This video presents these core elements and approval steps to help achieve success in your project in terms of staying on schedule, ensuring construction quality, managing costs, and complying with federal regulations so that you can receive federal aid funds for the project. Let us first discuss the core elements of the program before moving on to challenges and solutions related to the success of your project.
Project delivery within the Federal Aid Highway Program is represented as a series of interconnected phases that can affect each other. A project is born in the planning phase. Planning includes identifying the initial scope of the project, which is based on regional transportation improvement programs, road conditions, and other considerations. If your local public agency will use federal aid funds for a project, it is important to know that the project must be included in the approved State Transportation Improvement Program, otherwise known as the STIP. All projects in the STIP are identified activities in a long-term planning document referred to as the Long Range Transportation Plan, or the LRTP. Once a project is in an approved STIP, the project can be considered for federal aid funding. The second phase is environmental. Within the environmental phase, the NEPA process is a major part of the overall phase. NEPA refers to the National Environmental Policy Act and often is the first activity that uses project funds. This phase evaluates the project's impact on the human and natural environment and may even require consideration of alternatives. The NEPA process ultimately provides the project purpose and need, the conceptual location and design, and approval of the selected alternative based on the scope of work for the transportation project. Typically, no more than 30% of the project design is completed before the environmental phase is complete. The third phase is design. This phase is when the details necessary to construct the project are defined. At the end of the design phase, the plans, contract specifications, and estimated cost package is assembled. This PS&E package is submitted for review and approval before the project can move into construction. A well-developed PS&E helps to make sure you receive good bids and that the project can be constructed without significant problems. The fourth phase is right-of-way. Right-of-way may include the purchase of property or land use agreements that is needed to construct the project. If any right-of-way is needed for the project, it must be acquired in accordance with the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policies Act of 1970, otherwise known as the Uniform Act, even if federal funds are not needed until construction. Coordination with utilities and railroads also occurs during this phase. Construction is the fifth phase and is when the project is built. This phase includes physical construction by the contractor and administration of the contract and quality assurance by the local agency. The sixth and final phase is maintenance and operation of the constructed facilities. This phase includes opening the project for use by the public and making sure that it remains in good working order. Generally, project delivery is broken down into pre-award and post-award activities. Pre-award includes the first four phases of planning, environmental, design, and right-of-way, while post-award includes construction, contract administration, and maintenance, sometimes referred to as system preservation, and operations. Now that we have an idea of how a project moves through the core elements, let's highlight the three major project approval milestones: NEPA approval, PS&E approval, and final acceptance of the constructed project. The first milestone to complete is NEPA. This establishes the project purpose and need, the conceptual location and design, and approval of the selected alternative based on the scope of work for the transportation project. Environmental commitments may be necessary to mitigate the impacts anticipated from constructing the project. The second milestone is the approval of the PS&E package, which permits authorization for physical construction. Projects must not be advertised for bids unless you have received approval from your oversight agency. Finally, the third milestone is closing out the project, which incorporates final acceptance and final vouchering for the project. Closing out the project is when your responsibilities transition to maintaining and operating the facility.
Understanding the cradle-to-grave process will help you avoid unnecessary delays to your project. So, how do you stay on the route to success? By understanding how each of the 6 phases of your project are related within this cradle-to-grave process. You can avoid unnecessary delays to your project delivery schedule, growth in costs, or even affecting the public's trust. A solid understanding of the basic sequential activities common to delivering all transportation projects will reduce your risk of jeopardizing the use of federal aid funds and make your journey an efficient and productive one.
Okay. So you can see up here, I mean, basically the project life cycle brings in planning all the way to we're done. And the state, remember what we talked about earlier, the state's responsible for maintenance activities. So the intent is, federal highway, we're going to participate in the construction, and then once construction's done, it's up to the state to do maintenance, because we don't participate in maintenance other than preventative maintenance. So like mowing operations, snow removal, all that kind of stuff, those are not federally eligible activities. So from planning all the way to maintenance and operations, that's our project life cycle. Now I did change, they say pre-award, post-award. I threw in the construction piece in there because when we're talking about 2 CFR 200, award has a little bit different meaning. You know, federal award is the actual project agreement. Pre-construction award, that's still going to be a federal award if you're going to be having federal participation. So basically, planning, environment, design, and right-of-way are your pre-construction activities, and you can see down there we have our 4 milestones. We have NEPA, so we're doing the design, and you've got to final design, you have an idea of what your NEPA determination is going to be, and that's going to be our first milestone. That's going to be our first approval area. You know, we do have an authorization to do design, but the first milestone is going to be that NEPA determination. Now, we've delegated that to most of the states. You guys have assumed that responsibility, so you do the NEPA. You usually will review and make that determination and then decide to move into construction, or maybe the NEPA determination makes you decide not to do construction at all, and that's okay. As long as you have that determination and that's your final decision, then we don't care if it doesn't go to construction. When we talk about the PE 10-year rule, though, is if NEPA did say, hey, we can do construction, and you just choose not to do it, then you may have to pay back those funds, those design funds. That's what that PE 10-year rule is. If we are still in design or in the PE phase for 10 years, you have to justify why that project didn't move to construction. And if it didn't move to construction and your justification is we just decided not to do it, then you have to pay us back any federal dollars that we participated in that. Now, right-of-way, we have what's called the 20-year right-of-way rule. So let's say you get done with design and now you're in right-of-way, and right-of-way's been out there for 20 years and you'd never moved to construction. You have to justify why, and you may have to pay back your right-of-way costs. You don't have to pay back the PE because you didn't move to the next phase, but you would have to pay back right-of-way after that 20 years. We don't see that happen too much. We see more often the PE 10-year stuff versus the right-of-way 20-year. But basically, you can see down there, in the planning phase, we have our PL and our SPR. So, you know, you get your SPR, remember that's sub-allocated out of your 5 major activities besides PL, and that's what the states use to do your planning. That's what the states use to develop your STIP, to do studies, to do all of the different planning activities that your states incorporate into your annual work program. And then PL, those are the funds that your MPOs use and your TMAs use to build your TIPs and identify all the different planning activities and studies, corridor studies, plans, and all that kind of stuff that basically identify and initiate what you're going to do in the construction side of things oftentimes. And that's where it rolls right into that design phase then, and environment. And then we get to right-of-way. That's the other decision-making factor, is after right-of-way, we're ready to go to construction. So you should have a plan, specs, and estimates document to move forward with construction. And you have to get approval from Federal Highway Administration to move to construction. Then once construction's happening, now notice down there we have construction and then we have CEs. That means construction engineering. So not only are we going to be paying for, say, the contractor costs, but we're also going to pay for state DOT costs to oversee that project. You have engineers that go out and work on those projects, that oversee the contractors. They're charging their time to that project, and so we call that construction engineering. And it could also not just be state staff, but you could also have consultants that do that for you. So all of those different types of costs that are other than the contract, the construction contract, those are going to be your construction engineering costs. Now see that little 90-day, that 90 with the equal sign and the slash through it? That's basically saying that you have 90 days from after we've authorized the project and after you have went out for bid to adjust the project. So, you know, when you're authorizing the project, we're doing it based on estimates. It's what you think the project's going to cost, $1 million. But then you go out and you get your low bids in, and let's say the lowest bid out there is $1.2 million. The expectation is within 90 days you have to adjust that project to the best cost estimate, which is the actual contract price, and it's whether it's up or down. But what the regulations say is if it's less than, or if it's a decrease of $250,000 or more, you must do it within 90 days. If it's more than, you have to do it. It doesn't really say it in the regulations, but if you don't put the additional funds on there, then you're not authorized to incur those additional costs. So you must add costs if it's going to be an increase. But if it's going to be a decrease, you don't need to necessarily decrease it unless it's going to be $250,000 or more within 90 days. Then we're identifying in the very beginning what that end date's going to be for construction. And we're talking, I shouldn't say for construction, I should say for the project. Because final acceptance is when the engineers, for the most part, have accepted that the project's done. They've told the contractor, hey, okay, everything's good to go. The roadway's open to the public, but there's still a lot of activities that can happen after final acceptance that we have to account for in that period of performance. So, you know, your auditors, they might have to go out and do some audits on consultant agreements or something, or maybe there are still some, I don't know, other construction things that you have to do, you know, punch list stuff. I'm not sure if final acceptance, and maybe some engineers can tell me, is final acceptance before or after the punch list stuff? After? Okay. So maybe that's not an issue. But just remember, you have to build the additional time from final acceptance until you're actually going to close out the project. And that's where you have to really identify what those extra activities are. And that's where we see a lot of times where states are like, oh, we're not ready to close this out. We're pushing that end date, but the construction's done. But they're still pushing the end date, and they still need more time to do all the activities that they have to do. But that end date's really important because once you hit that end date, then you have 90 days to liquidate all your obligations and close the project. And that's the final voucher there. And then from final voucher, you have 3 years to maintain all of your documentation. That's your record retention. So any questions on project life cycle? Okay. So now we're going to be, this is referencing back into your project funds management guide that's in the back of your book. But basically what proper authorization means is federal and state laws and regulations have been met. So even though, like if we come out and do a review and you've followed all the federal rules, but we identify that maybe you didn't follow a state rule, it will still be a finding. Because the expectation is not only do you have to follow the federal rules, you also should be following the state rules, whatever your state rules say. So our expectation is you have to follow both of those. And some of those are 23 U.S.C., which is our highway law, 49 U.S.C., which is transportation law, 2 CFR, the uniform requirements, and then 23 CFR 630 for our agreements. And that's where, remember we just looked at that, where it said that you must have a project agreement before you begin any work. And then there's a lot of other rules out there that you may have to follow depending on the type of project. You know, if it's a construction project, you have to follow 23 CFR 635 that talks about all the construction stuff. And it doesn't matter if we're obligating funds or if you're using AC, all of these rules still have to be followed. AC does not basically give you an out to following federal rules, because eventually on an AC project you're going to want to get reimbursed and you're going to want to convert those to an obligation, and the only way that will allow you to do that is if you followed all the rules before those funds were actually obligated. So just remember, AC just allows you to start a project without having federal funds, get authorization without having federal funds, but you still have to follow all the federal rules if you eventually want to get reimbursed for those costs. So the Funds Management Guide says that to have a properly authorized project, we have to authorize before work starts or is advertised. And normally, what the rules say is a 3-week ad is the normal. You can go longer than that. You can go shorter than that if you can justify why. Like maybe there's an emergency event. Sometimes you may not even be able to advertise. If there's a big ER event, you need to get somebody in there to clear the road or something to make it safe for the public to drive on, you may not have the opportunity to advertise. And that's okay. But it's only in those circumstances. Everything else, you have to have at least a minimum 3-week ad, and you have to have authorization on the project before you even advertise. So, clearly defined project title, description, and scope of work. So if you remember those data elements in 2 CFR 200, it said that you have to have a project description that is in accordance with FAHP, which is our Transparency Act. What that basically says is every federal agency is required to report all of our projects to usaspending.gov. And so this is a website out there where you can actually go out and look at every single federal dollar that's being spent in your town or your area or in your state. You can whittle it down however you want. You can filter it however you want by program funds. But basically, we take the information out of FEMAS, and that's what we report to USA Spending. So in the past, before we actually had this requirement, and FEMAS actually had some limited spacing in some of our descriptions, we used a lot of abbreviations like CON for construction, PE for preliminary engineering, BR for bridge, and those are all understandable by the state, understandable by the division, but once we started pushing that stuff to USA Spending, the public didn't really understand what that stuff meant. So all we're saying now, and we've updated FEMAS, and we have enough characters for you to actually explain and give a good description in FEMAS for what that actual project's all about, because that's actually going to be what we push to USA Spending, and so that description needs to be written in a way where a layperson or the public, somebody who doesn't work in transportation, can understand what you're actually going to do. So, you know, spell out construction, identify your roadways by name versus mileposts maybe, that kind of stuff. Then period of performance is identified. So that is a big requirement. 2 CFR 200 requires that now, where you have a start date and an end date, and we have to have that on every project. And we have to establish what that federal share is. And then whatever you pick, we say pick it and stick it. Once you pick that federal share, that's the federal share that you should stick with. And most of the time, it's going to be your standard 80-20, and that's going to be throughout the life of the project unless you're doing lump sum. Also, funding must be supported by a documented, accurate, best cost estimate or current cost estimate. So that's where we're saying, and you know, contracts are a little easier because we say we have a PS&E that gives us an estimate, and then we have a contract price that this is how much it's going to cost, and so that's pretty easy. When we're talking about design, sometimes those are a little bit more difficult to identify what that current cost estimate is. I've seen some states go, well, we think construction is going to be $1 million, and so we're going to do 10% of our construction cost, and that's going to be our PE. So they might say $100,000 for PE. That might be okay, but you should have a method for going back and looking to see, is that really accurate? Because it may not be accurate on every project, and if we're just doing a flat 10% on every single project, plus you're not even went through design, so you can guesstimate what the construction is going to be, but you really don't know for sure until you get design done. So you should have a method for identifying what that PE amount is, a good method. Because if we're seeing a lot of ups and downs throughout the life of the design, that's like a first little yellow flag to maybe start looking and saying, okay, well, why are we seeing these up and downs? Maybe we should come up with a better way to do this estimate, or maybe, you know, this is a unique project and, you know, we need to adjust it or whatever. We can only authorize ready-to-proceed projects in phases. We see this sometimes in local projects where the local really wants to get their project, they're awarded the funds, they're excited to get started, they don't want to lose the funds, so they say, hey, can we get those funds allocated? We obligate them, and then they're not even ready to start that project for another 9 months to a year. And so it sits out there obligated, inactive. Then we have to go back and justify why it's inactive. So really, we want to make sure that if we're obligating, we should be seeing expenditures within 9 months. And the reason why we say 9 months is because if we don't see it in 9 months, then it's going to very likely show up on the inactive projects list when we come out with the year inactivity. So that's just another way that you can check it. When we talk about monitoring later, there are a lot of good tools out there now. I have a teammate on my team at the Resource Center, Josh Gutterman, who's developed really good analysis reports for state DOTs to use and division offices to use, where you can actually run a report and see every single active project in Oklahoma and where you're at, or if you're pushing the end dates on things, or are we past the end date on certain projects. You can run that report and identify every single project that's past the end date and past the 90 days, and that could be you could use that tool to reach out to the division office and ask for an extension. Or it could also identify from Federal Highway's perspective costs that were incurred after the end date that you might have to pay back. So those are all tools that you can use in your monitoring. Yes, I will. Yep, yeah, I will. And it's actually, if you're familiar with business objects, that's where you have to go, but it's basically a report out there that I think you can click and run right out of business objects, but I'll share that. Yep. So non-participating costs. You know, the intent is we want to see the total cost of the project. Even if we're not participating, we should see the total cost. So you should be including those non-participatings in your total cost and adjusting the participating to identify what your federal share is going to be. So if you have non-participating costs in your total cost, we want to make sure we can take those out and do the math to figure out what your pro rata is to make sure that you're actually participating on what it should be. Then, of course, it needs to be signed by the state and 2 federal highway folks. And we already heard that you guys sign it twice also. You have 2 individuals sign. So now we're back into CFR 200, and here's where we're going to talk a little bit more detail about period of performance. So the definition is, the period of performance is the period when project costs can be incurred and still be eligible for reimbursement. Does everybody know what incurred means? It's kind of like an accounting term, because you can incur a cost without actually spending any money. So if you have a contractor, they're doing the work, and they did it on September 27th, and they did that work, but they haven't sent you a bill yet, it was incurred on September 27th. And let's say September 30th is your end date. Well, you can bill those costs in October and still be okay, because they're for costs that actually happened within the period of performance. So that's what that means. Project agreement end date or start date. So this is when, and we've always kind of had this because this is our authorization date, but basically it's when we authorize the project to begin incurring costs, or it could be the phase of work on a project. But in Oklahoma, you guys have individual projects for each phase of work, so it would very much meet that definition of a project. Each phase is authorized only when that phase is ready to proceed. So we've already talked about that. We can't authorize multiple phases at the same time because it prematurely obligates funds. And authorization is not provided until the applicable requirements are met. So we're not going to authorize or obligate construction if NEPA is not done, or right-of-way if NEPA is not done. So what's it say about the end date? So the end date is the final date when the recipient or subrecipient can incur costs. It's based on the current schedule or scope of work. It includes time consideration for finalizing billing and ensuring all requirements are met. So that's what I was talking about is, if you've done final acceptance on the construction project, there could be another, and we heard you guys have about, is it 7 years on PE, and then what is it for construction? It depends? Yeah. So it depends on the complexity of the project, that kind of stuff? Okay. So you all have a formula that basically says, and I'm sure that formula includes, once construction's done, how much time you need after construction's done to do all of those other administrative activities, right? So that's basically what that ensuring all requirements are met and the finalizing of the billing is. There's a lot of activities after construction's done that you still have to account for. Because oftentimes, like auditors, when I was in Nevada, the auditors would actually charge their time to projects. If they were auditing a consultant agreement on a project, they would charge their time to that project, so we had to leave the projects open. Some states, the auditor's work is considered indirect or indirect costs, and it's either billed through an indirect cost allocation plan, or maybe you guys just state fund it yourself. And if that's the case, maybe that's not a reason to keep the project open. It all depends. We have to look at it. The end date may be modified for justified project modification. So whatever day you pick, we're not saying that's a drop-dead date that we're going to hold you to it. You can modify the date, but you have to have a reasonable justification as to why. So if you pick a date and you're pushing that date and you want to get an extension, then you just have to justify why. Now if it's, hey, we don't have enough time to work on it, that's probably not a reasonable justification. But if it's, hey, we had a big change, a contract change order that's going to increase the time we need to do the project, that's a reasonable justification, and you can ask for an extension for whatever period of time you need. Now, I'm going to talk about the 90 days here in a minute, but you also have to ask for an extension to the 90 days, which is separate from the end date. So let's say we have the end date and construction's done. You don't need any more time for incurring costs, so you're not going to ask for an extension to the end date, but maybe you need more time than the 90 days to get all of the bills submitted within that 90 days. Maybe you need 120 days. You can reach out to the division and you can say, hey, the project's done, the end date's still good, but we need more than 90 days to process all of our stuff and get it to you. Can we have an extension to the 90 days? So you can either ask for an extension to the 90 days or you can ask for an extension to the end date. But if you're asking for an extension on the end date, it has to be based on the contract schedule or the project needs to be extended. You still need to incur costs, that kind of stuff. So you have to kind of weigh which one you're going to actually ask for an extension on. Final costs must be billed and obligations liquidated within 90 days. Just talked about that. You can ask for an extension to that as well. And work performed after the end date is not allowable. So that's why it's really important to monitor that end date, because if you've hit the end date, and we do have some provisions out there that allow costs that were incurred prior to authorization to actually be billed, but we've actually asked the lawyers, got a legal determination, and let's say your end date's September 30th, you forgot to ask for an extension, your contractor's doing work October 1st through October 15th, and then you're like, oh, we need to extend our end date, we have to ask for an extension. You go to the division and say, hey, can we get an extension? On October 15th, if we say, yeah, we'll extend it another year, you'll be able to have a whole nother year, but from October 1st to October 15th, any costs incurred are unallowable, and you cannot bill. That's a big deal. That's why it's really important to monitor that end date and make sure that you're asking for an extension before that end date's actually hit. Otherwise, you could be stuck holding or having to pay for stuff out of your state funds. And there's no leeway in that. The lawyer said, sorry, we cannot allow any costs incurred after the end date and before an extension request is approved to be billed. They're all unallowable costs. Yes? I think the question was, where should the justifications for end dates be captured? And that can just be put into the remarks field of FEMAS. So when they send over something, they should adjust the end date to put out to whatever it needs to be, and then they should just justify in the remarks field what the justification is. And then you guys, when you're reviewing that and signing it, you can make a determination at that time if you're going to approve it or not. So that would be the state would have to put that stuff into FEMAS. Yes? Yeah, so with planning, it's a little bit different because, as we all know, planning is an annual program. So let's say you have a task in your work program that is going to do a study, and it's going to take them 2 years to do the study, right? And so you're going to put that in this year's work program, right? And then you're going to identify how much is going to be spent this year on that study, and then next year in your next year's work study, you're going to include that. Is that how you guys do it here? So how do you do it? But do they get it all done in 1 year, or could it cross over 2 different work program? So I'll tell you what would happen if an auditor came out. We do have like improper payment audits. If they were to select let's say an expense for a work program activity, and let's say your work program end date is September 30th, and that work was done after September 30th, and it was not included in your next year's work program, the auditors would say that's an improper payment. And you would have to pay for that with state dollars. So my suggestion on work programs is if you're truly working on a 1-year work program and you have a task that's going to cross work program years, you should be accounting for the work that's going to be done this year in this year's work program, and then next year you should identify in that same task or that same contract or whatever the activities that are going to happen in that next year. That way you're covered. Because you're going to have, and see, that's the other thing that we need to also consider is your period of performance on work program, exactly 1 year, or maybe you can extend it out 6 months or whatever. Yeah, so my recommendation is either make sure that you have that activity in 2 different work program years if it's going to cross, or make sure that your period of performance accounts for the time that that extra work has to happen. So if it's going to take them 1.5 years to do that study, then you should be accounting for that extra 6 months in your period of performance in that original project. That's the way I would either do it that way, or if you want to stick with your 1 year period of performance, then you need to account for that task in the next years, and it has to be incurred then. So basically all we have to make sure of is whatever your period of performance is, all work that's done has to be done within that period. So it could either be 1 year, it could be a 2-year, even on an annual project you could have a 2-year period of performance. I don't see why that would be incorrect, as long as you can justify, hey, we have some tasks in this year's program that's going to take 9 months or a year, or I'm sorry, a year and 6 months to do. Does that make sense? Okay. Once again, an obligation is the legal liability for the federal government to pay for goods and services. There's no commitment of the federal government if we don't have an obligation. We have to have a documented binding agreement, which is the FEMAS agreement. The agreement has to be between federal agency and the state DOT or another recipient. But for the most part, Federal Highway Administration, the state DOTs are our only recipient. We really don't give direct funding, especially federal aid dollars, to any other directly recipient other than the state DOT. Now, other entities get our funds, but those are going to be passed through from the state DOT. So your MPOs, we don't give the funds directly to the MPOs. They're passed through from ODOT to the MPOs, and that's the way it works. So Federal Highway really only has one recipient, and I know that there's a memo out there that's going to be coming out of the financial management and policy team, the team that I'm working on currently, that talks about recipients and who the recipients are in Federal Highway Administration. One big one that's going to make a big impact is rec trails, because we do sometimes give funds directly to the State Resource Agency to manage rec trails. But what they're saying up at our headquarters now is really rec trails is a subrecipient of the state DOT. So the state DOT might have some responsibilities coming up soon of overseeing rec trails, which is going to be a big deal to a lot of states, because most states aren't even involved in the Rec Trails program. It's a little small pot of money. It's like $1 million to $1.5 million in each state, but it's still federal dollars, and we're gonna and the decision now is ultimately the states are a recipient. So you all, you're probably not going to do the projects. The state resource agencies are probably going to still do the projects, but there's going to maybe need to be a little bit more communication between state DOT and the resource agencies.
Yeah, we do. You guys set up the project, but we don't have the project actually in our system. Tourism does it, but we contact them to let them know, hey, are you going to use the budget?
Yep.
So we budgeting part of it, and we have their funds.
Yeah, and that's good, but they're also talking about some project oversight as well, which is going to be the big deal. Yeah.
Oh, but we do, when it's inactive, it is on an inactive
Yep.
list, so we do that too.
And you follow up, yep.
Yeah, so maybe we do.
Yeah, you might.
Yeah.
Yeah, it might not impact a lot of states, but some states, I know they just say we wash our hands of it. It's rec trails, that's not our deal. It's not a, basically rec trails funds can be used off the system, off the NHS, off of the actual system. They're going to be on like local and rural minor collector roadways or trails that aren't even considered a roadway. And so state DOTs usually aren't too concerned with those. But we're basically we're coming down to say, hey, you should be a little bit concerned because there are still state DOT dollars that are passed through to the state resource agency. So what's a proper project obligation? So, and some of this stuff is a repeat. Clearly defined eligible scope of work. We have the obligation or funds amount necessary for the work. So in order for it to be a proper obligation, we have to make sure we have the funding available, right, if we're going to obligate it. Current cost estimate, still required. And you have to meet all those federal requirements. 630, 635 if it's construction. So now let's talk about advanced construction. So you guys use this, and a lot of states use this, and a lot of times it can just be used as a cash flow tool. And it's also really good for, on October 1st when Congress doesn't pass an appropriations bill, which is pretty much the most common thing that happens. We don't, I think I've been with Federal Highway since 2001, and maybe once, and I'm just guessing it's a once, that they actually passed a full year's appropriations on October 1st. Most of the time it's a continuing resolution, and maybe they'll say, hey, we need an extra month to work up this appropriation, so we're going to give you 365ths of obligation limitation that you got last year. So you're getting 30 days worth of a year. And what's your total budget here? What's your total apportionment in Oklahoma? About 450, 500, 680? Okay. So you guys get $680 million, and you can only obligate 30 days worth of that at the previous year's obligation limit, which maybe is, $50 million, let's just say. So you have 680, and you can only obligate 50 million. So how are you going to be able to let projects in October? Advanced construction's your way. You can get authorization. You can, we'll authorize the full price of the project. You can move forward with it, and you can incur costs. You still have to have all the other requirements, period of performance, end date, start date. Still have to follow NEPA, still have to follow everything, but we're not obligating any federal dollars. And you're doing it at your own risk. You're using state dollars until federal dollars become available, and there's never a guarantee that federal dollars will be available if we're under a continuing resolution. I've never seen it where Congress hasn't passed one, but it's out there, and we always say it's at your own risk, and it's state dollars on the hook. But most of the time, Congress will eventually pass an appropriations, and then you can convert your advanced construction into an obligation, and then you can start billing us for the costs that you've incurred. Because what happens in a state system, if we don't have an obligation on the federal side, you guys, it's called accruing, those expenses are accruing the billings. And so you are still incurring the cost, you're paying the contractors with state dollars, and you're accruing these costs in an accrued unbilled account. And then once you do have obligation, you can pull those accrued unbilleds, bill them to Federal Highway, and get reimbursed for the costs. But it has to be once we've obligated or converted that AC. So you can see up there, I think I covered most everything, all the points up there. We have to make sure we're still following all the provisions. Still have to follow, the Uniform Act in regards to right-of-way, NEPA, Buy America for any steel or iron incorporated into the project. Everything still has to be followed. But once you're ready and you do have the federal funds, you can convert and bill us. And I've seen some states, the way they do it is a cash flow tool. Colorado, they AC every single project. And then as bills come in, they just convert. But they only convert for the amount of the bill. In my mind, that's like way too much work, because they're having to go out and touch that project every time bills come in, but they like to do it because it allows them a little flexibility in their funding. You get a certain amount of funds, or maybe you release some old funds. Remember when we talked about lapsing? Funds are good for the year they're apportioned plus 3 years, but obligating those funds protects them from lapsing. So if you deobligate old funds, you have until September 30th of that year to get them reobligated in order to protect them from lapsing if they're old funds. So, some states will do that. They'll do everything AC, and then if some other projects release old funds that are eligible to be put onto an AC project, they can obligate those old funds and use them up instead of letting them lapse. So there's a lot of different reasons why we use AC. Some states don't use it at all. So what are some prohibited practices? So we talked about the proper obligations, but these are some of the prohibited things that we've seen. So we don't want to obligate funds before a project's ready to start. That's going to create inactive projects probably. So we don't want to obligate anything unless you're really truly ready to start expending funds. So you can't obligate funds just to protect them from lapsing. They have to be put on a legitimate project. If you have some funds that you've identified, let's say they're old interstate maintenance funds, and they're getting ready to lapse, and you're like, oh, we could maybe use those next year, but we don't really have a project to put them on this year, but hey, let's just obligate them on this project, and then on October 1st, we'll deobligate them, and then it'll go back into your pot, and you'll have that whole next year to figure out a place to put them. That would be an improper obligation. You cannot obligate them just to protect them from lapsing. Now, if you deobligate and you have some IM funds out there that are going to lapse, and you have a project, an interstate project that has AC on it, you could convert that AC and put those IM funds on it, and that would be a legitimate obligation because it's a legit project that's eligible for those funds, and you could do it that way. You just can't do it just to protect them from lapsing. Same thing with using up all your obligation limitation. We don't see this very much in states. States do a really good job of using up your limitation because remember, you have a $680 million program. You can only obligate 90% of it in 2020 because our obligation limitation this year is 90.7. So you can obligate 90.7% of it. But you guys probably have enough AC and projects on the books where you could easily use up your 90.7%. Some of our allocated programs make it a little bit more difficult. So that's why we have August redistribution. If you can't use your limitation, then it's redistributed to all the offices that can use additional limitation. And that's where we see most of the time it's like federal lands that doesn't use up all their limitation, and so we pull back whatever they can't use. We reach out to the states and say, hey, could you use some additional limitation? Almost every single state says yes, and we distribute out proportionately to what you want. Now you may ask for, hey, yeah, we could use an additional 10 million, and you might only get $1 million because it's going to be based on whatever's out there to redistribute. Authorizing projects for LPAs solely to reserve the funds for a future project. That's pretty much the same as, number 1 bullet. We don't want to obligate funds just to save them for the LPA. If they're not ready to start, then we can say, hey, especially if they're allocated funds, we can say, hey, we won't allocate them this year, we'll allocate them next year. I mean, they're still going to get them. We can still set them aside, but we don't want to allocate them and obligate them and have them sit out there unused for, a year or more. Yeah, as long as it's eligible, and it depends on the funds. If they're allocated funds, those are very specific for very specific activities. And so let's say, and Laura might be able to talk more about this, but I've seen it many times where a state will get, like, let's say DBE supportive services funds, and they'll say they'll get $100,000 and they'll only use 80, and they'll say, well, we'll just obligate this remaining 20,000 on some other project where we need, let's say, another OJT supportive services project that has a shortfall. You can't do that. It has to be very specifically used for the project it was awarded for. Now, federal aid funds, we have a lot more flexibility there. So if there's some PL funds or other types of federal aid funds that get released off a project and you can find another eligible project to put them on, that would be okay. If they're suballocated, we're not supposed to transfer any suballocated funds. So if something is specifically for, say, Oklahoma City, and you want to move those funds because they didn't use them to another TMA, there's a big, long process to allow that. I mean, you'd have to get agreement from here, and then they would have to probably pay it back later, and so that would be, I don't think they do that. Now, if it's not suballocated, okay. Yeah, I don't think we can do that. Now, if they're not suballocated, then yeah, we could move things around. Do you have something else to add?
Well, I was going to say, what the key point and underlying factor here that you want to make sure you're paying attention to, if you have unused funds that you want to use again, you got to be very careful. You're using for the eligible, allowable purpose, because you're not parking them. That's a violation of appropriations law. You can't just park money and bounce it out a couple of times. So if you've got, like you as an example, and we have run into this, I spent a good part of my year last year cleaning up where states took unused OJT supportive services funds from 2013 and decided to use it on their 2019 project. Well, it's not allowable. It wasn't, the expenses themselves are eligible, but it wasn't allowable because that was not the project that was authorized in that allocated program. Allocated programs, this is a big risk area with them that you have to pay attention to, because if you do that, it's an improper obligation that's going to result in an improper payment, and that's a big deal. So you want to make sure you're not violating appropriations law by parking money. That's a huge no-no. It gets a lot of people into trouble. And then two, make sure you're using it, because if it's not an allowable expense, you'll come back and you'll have to reverse. We had to work with states. We had to reverse all their charges and use state funding to cover the expenses that weren't incurred because they were not allowable. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Okay, so we just talked about prohibited practices for obligating. We also have prohibited practices for deobligating. So basically, deobligating funds solely to free them up, replace them with other funds, or use AC, or what we call reverse AC. So what that means is you have an obligated project, and you're like, hey, look, we have the CMAQ funds obligated on this project, and we want to use those somewhere else, so we're going to deobligate them, make that project now an AC project, and move those CMAQ funds to another project and use them there. That would be reverse AC because you didn't start with an advanced construction. You converted it to an advanced construction once it was already obligated. So basically, this is where we also say pick it and stick it. If you've obligated funds on a project and those funds are eligible for that project, you must keep those funds on that project for the life of that project. You cannot release any funds that you've obligated on a project that are legitimate, eligible funds that could be used on that project. So that is a prohibited practice. Also, we do have some things like ER where you can obligate, maybe you have an ER event and we haven't issued the ER funds yet because it has to go through a whole big, long process to get the funds issued. But you guys need to get the roadways working, right? So you can obligate like STBG funds or NHPP funds if it's on an interstate, and you can expend those funds, and then when you're issued the ER allocation, you can go back out, credit, and pay back all of those expenditures, deobligate the federal aid funds that you have on it, then obligate the ER, and then rebuild those costs. That's really the only time we allow swapping of funds. What's that?
We
Yeah. Yep, and it happens almost every time on ER. And we actually have it in our law that says ER is one of the exceptions. And it's really the only exception now. It used to be demo projects, high priority projects, those pork barrel, projects. We allowed that at that time, but we don't have those anymore. We have old ones, but now there's no reason to do that. Okay, deobligating funds from projects with no expenditures but leaving a token obligation of federal funds. That's like, and this we don't really see this too much anymore, but we saw this a lot when we did our inactives, and we had thresholds where we were only focusing on those that had a $250,000 inactive balance. So we saw some states, well, let's just deobligate it down to $10,000, and then it won't show up on Federal Highways list, and we can slide through that one and wait till next year to work on it. So we don't see that too much anymore because we don't have thresholds. Now, if it's a $0 inactive or a $1 million inactive, you have to respond and tell us why it's inactive. But then that note, and I'll give you an example. When a project agreement does not reflect the total cost under these conditions, costs incurred are unallowable because funds to cover such costs are not properly authorized. So that is not just in deobligating, but it's also tied to your best cost estimate. So I've seen this many times where a state doesn't want to really adjust their project, and this was the excuse that I was given, or the reason I was given, I shouldn't say excuse. So the reason was, hey, it's too burdensome for us to always go out and touch these projects, so we're going to true it up at the end. That's what we always hear, true it up at the end. And certain reconciliation and adjustments at the end are okay, but let's say, and I talked about accrued unbilled, because it works the same exact way for projects that are AC or for projects that don't have the correct obligation on the project. So maybe you have a project that's $1 million and you don't have any AC on that project, but you're still incurring costs. And you can't bill them to Federal Highway because you don't have enough obligation on that project. So you don't have enough best cost estimate. It's not to the best cost estimate. And then at the end of the project, you're like, hey, look, we have $300,000 sitting in our accrued unbilled that should have been billed to this project, but we didn't have enough obligation on it. So when you're doing your final voucher, let's bump that project up by $300,000 and bill Federal Highway for these costs. Technically, we never authorized those costs. You incurred those costs without having the best cost estimate on the project, and we could come back and say, sorry, those are unallowable costs because they were never authorized. So it's really important to maintain that best cost estimate. Now, sometimes we see adjustments at the end, like overruns and underruns. Those are legitimate, understandable. You're not going to go out and touch a project every single time there's an overrun or an underrun. But if there's true change orders, and the example I used was, why are you adjusting this at the end of the project? And they said, well, we forgot to put a design contract on this project in the very beginning. I mean, this was a construction project, and this was design that they never ever added even in the design phase, and they're adding it at final voucher. They ended up getting stuck with about a $500,000 bill that they had to pay for with state funds because they did not have the best cost estimate, and they didn't have the funds authorized, and they expended them without authorization. So just maintain and make sure that you're monitoring your costs, and you should be okay. Yep. Yeah, you can adjust your best cost estimate. As costs come in and are different, you can go up and down. So, our best cost estimate's usually based on a contract price if we're talking about a construction project. So what's going to change that cost? It's most likely going to be overruns and underruns, or changes in the design of the project that are going to require some additional costs to happen. But when you find out about those different changes, you should be making a modification to the project at that time and not waiting until the end or for a long time. Yeah, that would be, if you're changing the authorization, you're also changing the obligation. Or you could, if you didn't have funding, you could change the authorization and just do AC for the difference and then convert it later. So this brings us to monitoring again, and this is internal monitoring. This is what I was talking about on those business objects reports that I'll share with you. But basically, you should be doing continuous monitoring just to make sure that you're not pushing those deadlines. Because now that we have all these dates that we have to track, like end dates, authorization dates, we have to make sure that we always have the correct information in FEMAS, the most up-to-date information in FEMAS. So we've created these reports that you can easily run and identify where your issue areas are, and then go out and, you know, fix it before it becomes a problem. So if you can identify, oh look, we have 30 projects that are 30 days away from the end date, you can go out, have somebody look at all 30 of those projects, say, hey, do we need more time on these projects, or are they truly done and we're pushing that 30 days and they'll be complete, or do we need more time? Then you can use that, whatever answers you get, to reach out and say, hey, division office, we need, you know, some extra time on this project, we need some extra time on this project, and identify what that extra time is that's needed. So if a project's not progressing promptly, then we should withdraw it or close it. So project modifications. This is in 23 CFR 630, and this talks about when do we need to do those modifications. So 106 requires that costs on a project have to be supported by a documented cost estimate that's based on the state's best estimate of costs. So if you have your contractor's estimate plus any change orders, that's going to be your best cost estimate, and that's what it should be in FEMAS. And then we'll pay our fair share. So you have to maintain a process to adjust estimates when the bid's approved, adjust them to actuals after the award or contract prices. If there's a design change or a project phase is complete and you're moving to the next phase, those are all times when you should be adjusting the project agreement. Costs could be determined ineligible if not obligated prior to incurring the additional costs. That's what that note said on the last page. So now let's talk about construction changes. And I kind of mentioned this earlier about major changes and non-major changes, and in regards to the stewardship and oversight. So we basically have allowed the states to assume the responsibilities to approve these. So you can see there, all major changes and all major work shall have formal approval by division, and approval is in advance of the effective dates. So we've basically let the states assume that responsibility on our behalf. So you all get to decide when a major change is approved and when a non-major change is approved. But when it's approved, you have to, if it's a major change, make sure that we have authorization in FEMAS before you start work on that, because that's what the rules say. We're saying that you're assuming the approval of that on our behalf, but it's still, you can approve the change, the major change, but you still have to get authorization from Federal Highway through the FEMAS agreement before you incur costs, and that's on major changes. For non-major work, that's a little bit less formal. We do have to eventually have formal approval, but we can do it retroactively. So this is where we're talking about maybe different thresholds for changes or overruns and underruns, those kind of things. You don't have to identify those immediately and get them into FEMAS before you actually incur the cost, because you may not even be aware that you're overrunning until you've actually overran. So we understand that. And so we can do retroactive on those, and those are a little bit easier to manage. But the major changes, that's the big one that you have to be focused on. And does anybody know what those thresholds are in Oklahoma? Because this is what the regulations say. It's up to the states and the division offices to determine what the definition of a major change is versus a non-major. Does anybody know what it is here? A lot of times it might be in your spec books. Yes.
We're not bringing it back to make any, but usually what we have done with the STIP changes is establish some thresholds. Recently we talked about 50% increase in cost estimate that would trigger, and if the amount is over $4 million.
And that would trigger a modification to the STIP for fiscal constraint?
An amendment.
Oh, an amendment? Yeah, that would be a little bit different than what we're talking about here, but that's still a good process, because if you're talking a fiscally constrained STIP and you have a $680 million program and you've got $680 million programmed in there, and 2 projects go over, you have to make adjustments somewhere, right? You have to, and that's why it's good to have that maybe 50%, because you have a little bit of wiggle room, and a lot of states, I think, overprogram their STIP just a tiny bit to account for overruns and underruns and that kind of stuff. But if you're seeing big major changes, you're going to have to drop a project off the STIP in order to fund this big major change. Then you have to do those amendments. So does anybody know what the actual rules are for major change? Yes. Okay. So major change in scope of work would require a formal approval before you incur costs, and what I heard was a threshold or a threshold of $100,000 or more. So if the change is going to be $100,000 or more, then we should have a formal approval, right? Is that what I heard? Yeah, that makes sense. That seems pretty standard. So just make sure that you're aware of what those rules are, because that's going to drive on when you can actually start doing the work. So project modifications, we should be doing a regular review of these, not at the end of the project or at the end of a phase. We should be doing continuous monitoring, and it could just be a matter of just running those reports to give you an idea, because we can run reports also for, cost. We can say, let's see every single project in Oklahoma that is 95% expended. And then you could go out and look and say, okay, we have like these 100 projects that are pushing the obligation, and we may have to go out and check and see if those need to be modified. Maybe they're legit and good and they're almost done, but maybe some of them aren't done, and there's some funding that you need to put on those in order to cover any additional costs. So we're going to talk about internal controls a little bit more tomorrow, but SOPs are so important, and I know people say that a lot, but if you have somebody who's worked at the agency for 30 years and they retire, and you want somebody else to come in behind them and do what they did, if they don't have something written down on what they did, it's going to be a struggle for that new person. So it's very important, and we test this when we do our internal control reviews, when we do our improper payment reviews, when we do process reviews. We're always looking at SOPs, desk manuals, processes and procedures, and so you have to have really good SOPs in order to have a good program. And SOPs are an internal control tool, but they basically ensure that all of the rules are being followed. This person who worked here for 30 years, they might know all the rules backwards and forwards in their head, and they've never made a mistake, but the next person that comes in may not have that experience, and so they have to have some sort of resource to get that information. So SOPs and desk manuals, highly recommended, and everybody should have that. And most states already have that idea, because you all have to follow internal control procedures as well, and this is a big deal in most federal government and state government. Okay, we're almost done. We're going to cover these closeouts, and then we'll head out. So closeout, non-federal entities, and this is 2 CFR 200. This is where it says that you have to submit your reports, liquidate your obligations within 90 days of that end date. And it says there, Federal Highway may exercise unilateral authority to close projects in FEMA if a recipient fails to comply with project closeout requirements. So that's basically saying if we're seeing a bunch of projects sitting out there, we've already reached out to you, we've already asked for you to close them out or to give us some feedback, and we're not getting anything back, we can go out and just close those projects. And if we do that, any costs that are incurred after that closure are going to be on you, on ODOT or whoever that we're doing that to. So just make sure that you're monitoring again to make sure that you're not pushing that 90-day limit. And if you need extra time, you can ask for it. We'll give you, up to probably a year, because you'll see here in the next slide that we have 1 year to close a project once you guys have submitted it to us. And we can turn around a project closeout like in 24 to 48 hours usually. Final vouchers might take us a little bit longer. I'm not sure. Chandler, how long does it take for you guys to process a final voucher once it comes across your desk? Yeah, so like a couple days, maybe a week. And so we have a whole lot of extra time to give you if you need extra time. So if you need more than the 90 days, just ask, and we'll probably be happy to give you some extra time to close it out. Just make sure that we're not processing payments that are incurred after the end date. So just remember, you have to ask for an extension to the 90 days, but you also have to ask for an extension to the end date. But the end date is based on work that still needs to happen and costs that still need to be incurred, and the 90 days is just, hey, we need a little bit of extra time to do all the paperwork. But all of the costs that you're processing in that 90 days or the 120 days or however much time you need are for costs that were incurred prior to the end date, if that makes sense. So when do we consider a project complete? When the work's accepted and all the work and deliverables and the administrative actions are completed within the period of performance. So project closeout occurs when the state submits a request to Federal Highway to close a project. That's usually called a final voucher. And we're going to go ahead and review that final voucher. There could possibly be a final payment in there, or it could be you guys have already submitted all the payments and you're just closing out the project. And effective project management requires coordination of activities among all units and functions. So this is where, I don't know if you guys have had the project closeout mapping here. Have you guys had that? It's called it's process mapping. It's something that our PMIT, which is the Performance Management Improvement Team, which is kind of now dissolved, but our Resource Center team, Wes's team, is kind of taking on some of these functions now where we'll actually go out to a state, and I've done a couple of them, one in California and one in Wyoming, where we will sit down with the entire state DOT, and there'll be different sessions, but usually there's the same people, like kind of the leadership and some of the folks that are organizing it sit in all the sessions, and then we bring in different folks from each different department and do this mapping workshop. And if it works, and if it's implemented after we do the process map, which is basically a flow chart of the process, it helps a lot, the state, do your program. And what we found is, like when we were in California, their time to close out projects was, and this was after construction was done, was 2.5 years. So this is after the project was completed. It took them an additional 2.5 years to close the project. And when we got everybody in the room, and we had construction folks and the finance folks in the room, and we said, okay, what's the next step? And they're like, well, it takes us a long time because we're waiting for this document from construction to be sent over. And then once we get that document, then we can process the stuff. Well, then construction's sitting in the room going, well, we never knew that you needed that document. And so it's just identifying these communication gaps can really solve a lot of your problems. So it's really important that everybody is involved in project closeout, not just finance. So get together with your different departments. Figure out, hey, what does finance need to close this stuff out? What does construction need from somebody else to close something out, like materials kind of things. I've seen materials hold up closing out a project on the construction side because they're waiting for some certification from materials to come in that they didn't know that they needed to send over. So it's just almost could be just a matter of communication. So I highly recommend, if you do want to do process mapping, reach out to the division office and they can initiate a service request and maybe we can come out and do that. And we can really process map. The ones I've done are project closeout, but we can really map any process. So we can map project authorization. We can map a specific, a specific program area like rail highway crossing or whatever. So it's really up to you what you want to be mapped, but I highly recommend that if you can. Bring that here. It's a good thing to do. Okay, record retention. Basically 3 years after final voucher. So remember, I said it earlier, this is based on the date that we signed the project in FEMAS. So when we've signed that final project in FEMAS, that's what starts your 3-year period. So as I said earlier, sometimes we've seen where local governments will think that they're done because they got their final payment from the state. They start their clock, they go 3 years, they throw away all their documents, and that project's still sitting open and active in FEMAS. And if we pull it, because we usually, we don't usually pull closed projects, but when we're doing a review, we'll pull active projects. And it's happened where we went out, asked for their documents, and they said, well, we were done with that project 4 years ago, and we threw away our records, and they got stuck holding the bill, though the state picked it up, because the state was the one that didn't actually close the project in FEMAS. But it's a big deal. So just make sure, and this is where it comes into communication between you and the MPO, because you guys don't do a lot of subrecipients, but you should be telling the MPO, hey, this is your end date. You need to keep your records from this date. So when you close that work program project in FEMAS, there should be a communication from ODOT back to the MPO that says, here's your end date, and now you need to keep your records for at least 3 years. Now, a lot of states have a longer record retention. What is your record retention in Oklahoma? Is it 3 years or more? Okay. Well, hopefully it's at least 3 years. If it's more than 3 years, that's okay, because that's more restrictive. So we're good with 5 years or 10 years, but you have to at least keep them for 3. So some of the exceptions, we have audits. If there's an audit, you need to keep those records for 3 years after you resolve the audit. Same thing with claims. So if you have a contractor claim that's keeping your project from, maybe you've closed the project, but there's some sort of litigation or something on that project, you need to have something in your system that'll flag that to not allow you to dispose of any records or start that disposition until that litigation is complete. Once the litigation is complete, even if the project's closed, your time, the 3-year time period, starts when that litigation's done. So you have to have just a method to track those kind of things. Then real property and equipment, if we procured any kind of equipment with federal dollars and you charge that to a project, even if that project's closed, as long as you're using that equipment, that equipment is active. Once you dispose of the equipment, whether it's selling it or salvaging it or whatever, that's when the day you start the 3 years, is from when you disposition that equipment. So you have to keep your records for as long as you have the equipment, plus 3 years basically. Then indirect costs, you guys don't use that here, but basically if it's a negotiated rate, you have to keep it for 3 years after you submit it. If it's a non-negotiated rate, it's 3 years from the end of the year in which the rate was used. Can we reopen a project? Yes, we can. So sometimes it's better to close a project and then reopen it later instead of keeping it open and it becoming inactive. So if there's a way that you can close a project because you're done, and I'm going to use an example of, let's say, warranty for like plant establishment. Sometimes we'll see projects stay open for a long period of time because of this plant establishment period. And let's say the contractor has a year or a year and a half to ensure that the plants, whatever was planted, survives that year and a half. And if they don't, then it's the contractor's responsibility to go back and remedy whatever the issue is, right? But they're doing it at their own cost. So there's really not a cost associated with that plant establishment period. So it makes sense that we don't keep a project open for a year and a half during plant establishment. We can close it. And then if there's some reason why we are going to participate, let's say it was out of the contractor's control that the plants died or whatever, and we need to go back and reopen that project and charge costs, we can. I've also heard from states, well, what about our engineers that have to go out and monitor to make sure that the contractors are checking it and they want to charge their time to the project? If that's the case, then you can keep the project open because we have activity. We have people charging to the project. It's not going to become inactive. Where we want to maybe close it and reopen it is if we know that there's not going to be any financial activity on that project, but we still want to keep an eye on it because we have this warranty in there. Then in those cases, you could close the project, and then if you need to, you could reopen it later. We can also reopen it if we were to do a review on a closed project, which we don't do very often, but if we were to identify some improper payment, we can reopen the project, have you guys pay us back, and then you can readjust it, deobligate, and close it. Oh, and that last bullet, remember, if we reopen a project and then reclose it, your record retention period starts all over from the new date. So just remember that. Okay, these are our last two slides. These are basically, and these are in the back of your book, but basically this gives you an example of the timeline, the project agreement timeline for a design project for PE. So you can see up there, for period of performance, we have project completion period based on contractual information. So if you're hiring a consultant to do design, they're going to be able to tell you about how long they think they're going to get it done in. Or you may have an expectation, we want this to be done in this amount of time. So you're going to figure in that time period. And that's going to be from our authorization date until when we think that that consultant's going to be done. Then you need to add, and that up there says 3 to 6 months, but that could be any number. It has to be a legitimate number. It has to be based on your processes, but it's an additional amount of time after the contract work is done that you need to close out that project. So it could be 3 to 6 months. It could be a year. It could be 2 years. Just make sure during that time period we have some activity on the project, expenditure activity. Otherwise, the project's going to become inactive. So you have to figure in the contract information plus your administrative activities, and then that's going to be your end date. Whatever that date is, when you think you're going to get all those administrative activities done, that's going to be your end date, and that's going to be the period of time that you can actually incur costs. Then we have our 3-month, up to 3 months, or that's that 90 days, to submit all the paperwork. So once that end date's hit, now ODOT, you have an additional 90 days to process everything, send any information over to the division office, submit your final voucher, and close the project out. And then once it comes over to us, we have a whole year. And we can usually knock them out like within a week at the max, unless there's an issue. But most of the time, we can get them done way faster than a year. So remember, we can extend the end date, which extends the time that you can incur costs, or we can extend the 90 days as well. But if you need more time to submit because I've seen some states like, hey, we need more time, so we're going to extend our end date. Well, that's not what you should do if you need more time to process your administrative payments and that kind of stuff. You just have to extend the end date, or extend the 90 days. The only time you're going to extend the end date is if you truly need more time to incur costs. There's still work happening. And then this is the construction one. It's, for the most part, pretty much the same, but you can see up there we have 2 to 4 months for advertisement and award. And so it's like a 3-week ad, but you have to review bids, you have to open bids, you have to maybe do some negotiation, you have to select. So we have 2 to 4 months, whatever you all feel like you need. Then we have our basically contract schedule, so the schedule of time that it's going to take for them to do the work. Then you have your wrap-up stuff, all of your administrative activities. So it's, for the most part, very similar to PE. And it sounds like here you guys have a process for determining your period of performance for design, which is about 7 years. And then you have a formula that you run on your construction projects to figure out what your end date's going to be for construction projects. And that's based on probably the dollar value and complexity of the project. Probably a whole bunch of different things go into that, right? Yeah, that's good. Okay. Any questions on what we covered? All right, let's do one more Kahoot, and then we'll knock off for the day. Has everybody signed the sign-in sheet for this afternoon? Put your initials. Okay. Everybody in? Ready? Okay, 5 questions. What federal assistance instrument is primarily used in federal highway? Yeah, grant agreement. So remember contracts, those are more like federal contracts for doing, like our federal lands might use those. Cooperative agreements, we need substantial involvement. Fixed amount award doesn't qualify for us because we have cost sharing and matching, so grant agreement is the correct answer. Money man, almost done, that's true. Ooh, beer, cookies, and candy.
Wes, it's almost time.
What section of 23 CFR are the project agreement provisions located? Yeah, so 23 CFR 630. We'll talk about 172 tomorrow. That's the A&E selection of A&E firms. 420 is planning, and 771 is environment. So let's see who got it right. Ooh, beer, cookies, and candy. Really tired. I'm tired too. Smiley face, Gus, and let's play. All right. And end game is the highest climber. Okay, Federal Highway is not committed to pay states for expenses on an AC project. Yeah, that's true. So when are we committed to pay? Right. Once it's converted, when we convert, it becomes an obligation. So if it's just AC, there's no obligation, so we're not committed to pay. All right. Beer, cookie, and candy still up at the top. Okay, number 4. How long must project documents be kept on a project? Yeah, so 3 years from final voucher. So it's from the date that we sign off on that final voucher. Ooh. We had a little bit of moving around there. It's still pretty much the same top 5 though. Okay, last question. The last date when a recipient, subrecipient may incur costs is called? Yeah, it's the end date. So we have our start date is when you can start incurring costs, and the end date's when you have to stop incurring costs. And the winners, all right, beer, cookie, and candy, number 3. Let's play, number 2. Smiley emoji. All right.